Radical Cosmopolitanism and the Tradition of Insurgent Universality by James D. Ingram. This is from the Routledge Handbook of Cosmopolitan Studies. Or, what the hell is this thing called? Routledge International Handbook of Cosmopolitanism Studies, edited by Gerard Delanty. This is like a side interest of mine, is the concept of cosmopolitanism, so maybe this won't perfectly fit within the stated restrictions or the stated, what's the word? Description of the channel, game plan of the channel, but you know what? I just record whatever I feel like reading, because I'm badass. Okay. Radical Cosmopolitanism and the Tradition of Insurgent Universality by James D. Ingram. Cosmopolitanism is radical in the most common political ideological sense when it pushes the principle of world citizenship to extremes, setting this principle against the status quo. Cosmopolitanism is radical in the etymological sense when it goes to the root core essence of the idea. In this chapter, I will argue that the best candidate for a radical cosmopolitanism in both senses is a tradition of revolutionary politics that first emerged in modern Europe but quickly moved beyond it. I make no claim to an exhaustive treatment of the subject. Many other forms of cosmopolitanism can claim to be radical, from artistic practices to ways of life to ethical theories or comportments. But none can lay a strong claim to but none can lay as strong a claim to radicalness as this particular form of politics, which combines a desire to transform the social political order with a return to the root of an idea whose origins were political. Locating the origins of radical cosmopolitanism in the West is apt to rouse suspicions with which cosmopolitanism is often greeted. In radical political as well as cultural and philosophical quarters, cosmopolitanism is often identified not only with an elitism that is by turns aloof and overweening, but more specifically with Eurocentrism and imperialism. In recent years, such accusations have become especially such accusations come especially from anti, post, and decolonial critics who see a continuity from cosmopolitanism's imagined classical origins through the period of high European imperialism to its more recent use to justify the unification and homogenization of the world along Western lines, with the universalization of capitalism and the nation-state understood as the spread of modernity and progress. For such critics, nothing could be more cosmopolitan than to claim universality for a Western particular that finds itself in a position of dominance. The radical cosmopolitanism I sketch in the following pages is indeed born of the hegemonic Eurocentric cosmopolitanism. But it is an insubordinate, rebellious offspring. It arose out of Western modernity, but in reaction to and in opposition against Western modernity. In this, as I will explain, it was in fact honoring its ancient ancestor. No sooner was this radical cosmopolitanism born, moreover, than it fled its metropolitan home, re-emerging at the farthest reaches of the global system. Radical cosmopolitanism's contentiousness and restlessness, its propensity to challenge the dominant and to favor the margins, are among its defining traits. In the end, we will see that this minor tradition of cosmopolitanism troubles not only the more familiar Eurocentric current of cosmopolitanism, but also the latter's anti, post, and decolonial opponents, as I will show by tracing its path from classical Greece to revolutionary France to late colonial Haiti. Radical cosmopolitanism overlaps and shares elements with both of these perspectives, but coincides with neither. Radical cosmopolitanism is universalistic, but radical cosmopolitanism expresses the universal as insurgent, as challenging what is taken for universal in a particular time and place. This radical tradition is never more universalistic than when it seeks to throw off or transform the very powers that brought it into being. It is those who fight the dominant powers in the name of the subaltern, the oppressed and excluded, the colonized and the global South, who are the true cosmopolitans, the agents of the universalization of the universal. Insurgent radical cosmopolitanism can thus denote the agent and author of a process of universalization that is destined to oppose dominant forms of universalism again and again. The unruly process continually produces ambiguities and reversals that displace and recast that very universality without ever coming to rest, sparing neither cosmopolitanism nor post-colonialism. But to see the roots of this, we must first return to cosmopolitanism's birthplace, to Greece. A cynic provocation. Cosmopolitanism was born radical when Diogenes, the cynic, pronounced himself a cosmopolitus, a citizen of the world or cosmos. He was being radical in the familiar sense of immoderate or extreme, insofar as he rejected the prevailing cultural, social, and political order. If he did not explicitly call for its overthrow, his coinage gestured towards a new kind of citizenship and membership that could only have struck his interlocutors as inconceivable. What made his intervention so provocative was its radicalness in the second etymological sense. It went to the very root or fundament of Greek life. Any civilized Greek knew that one could not be a citizen of the cosmos of nature itself, and that to insist on being one was to place oneself outside society and even humanity, among Aristotle's gods and beasts. The idea of a citizen of the world violated the generally shared understanding, not only of citizenship, identity, and belonging, but of social and political order itself. The real shock in the notion of cosmopolitanism is that it opens a gap between nature and the city, that it then expresses in political terms. By articulating this gap in terms of citizenship, membership, belonging, identity, allegiance, Diogenes turned it into a question of which laws one should recognize, with and against whom one should identify, cooperate, and struggle, what one should seek, and what means one might employ in doing so. His gesture of siding politically against the polis, its laws, customs, and roles, thus posed an immense challenge for anyone willing to take it seriously. For if, as even more temperate philosophers agreed, nature is greater, truer, more encompassing and permanent than laws or conventions, which are various and mutable, then justice and wisdom must be on the side of nature. And if the two are at odds, was the friend of nature, truth, and the universal not bound to take the cynic's side? To be sure, there were ways out of this difficulty, notably philosophy and theology. By identifying the universal with truth or transcendence, they situated it at a safe distance from politics, allowing one to ally oneself with nature within the delimited sphere of contemplation or worship. One could even go so far as to devote oneself to the universal entirely as a sage or hermit, provided one gave up the local earthly concerns of politics. Diogenes blocked this escape route, however, by declaring his political allegiance to nature. He claimed citizenship in a universal community that is not yet a community, unless, that is, it already includes everyone unawares, contrary to where they believed their belonging and allegiance lay. And because cosmopolitanism suspends this politics between asymmetrical poles, with the negative pole marked as the particular community, and the positive one left indeterminate, defined only by its universality, Diogenes' challenge seems unlikely to lose its explosive charge in anything but a utopian future. In politics, one way to diffuse this charge was to claim that the gap between nature and politics was not in the end so large. This is most notably accomplished by means of the idea of natural law, attributed to cynicism's immediate inheritor, Stoicism. by finding the existing human order or some project that could be built out of it sufficiently in line with the commands of nature, or God or reason, Stoicism assured contemporaries that they need not worry overmuch about the gap between them. Rome's affairs with the barbarians, or Europe's with the world, opened by the age of discovery, could be governed by this natural law without any drastic changes to the status quo. Small wonder, then, that natural lawyers were perceived by certain cosmopolitans as, quote, sorry comforters, end quote. Immanuel Kant. The quote from Immanuel Kant. And small wonder, too, that self-proclaimed cosmopolitans ever since, often following in Kant's footsteps, have acquired a similar reputation among their radical contemporaries. This is root of moderate cosmopolitanism, which calls for the reform of the existing or emerging global order, even as it, by the same stroke, naturalizes and justifies that order. Radical cosmopolitans, in contrast, insist with Diogenes that a just order, one in accordance with reason, morality, or nature, requires the transformation, even the overthrow of the existing one. And they further radicalize his provocation by insisting that this must be done politically, rather than try, as some have, to find in Diogenes a positive vision for such a politics. I will accept the standard interpretation, namely that his own path was that of a politico-philosophical hermit, agitating for nature as he saw it against the city, even in the city's midst. Let us then leave the Greeks to consider some of those who have tried to give concrete political expression to his radical cosmopolitan demand. The demand, as I understand it, is that no one should be denied universal justice, and that no one should be allowed to determine for them what it is. Universal justice is. This demand, as I understand it, is that no one should be denied universal justice, and that no one should be allowed to determine for them what universal justice is. Radical cosmopolitanism as insurgent universality. As cosmopolitan studies has flourished, it has discovered a rich variety of cosmopolitanisms throughout history and the world's many traditions. Some of these cosmopolitanisms have been activist or even militant, from spiritual or artistic movements to chiliastic sects to conquering civilizations. There are nevertheless good reasons for privileging modernity as the field for radical cosmopolitanism. The first is geographical, a matter not simply of space, but of how it is imagined. It was only after the globe was compassed and mapped, so not long after 1492, that it became possible to imagine, and to imagine oneself acting in, a world that is unified, concretely universal. The universal, not just as an aspiration, but as a field of action, reciprocal relations, and potential solidarities, only became actual, current, and real with the emergence of a single world system. Wallerstein, 1995. The second reason is temporal. Universalist radicalism became possible only with the emergence of a new experience of history, one that made it possible for human beings to imagine through their own activity, stepping outside the cycles of history and initiating a novum, an unprecedented social, political, and moral order. It requires, in other words, not only a global field of action, but also a concept of action that can aspire to radical social transformation towards universal goals. These two factors came together, constituting a new political imaginary, in the Age of Revolution, and more specifically in the wake of 1789. As if to confirm this, we find the word, quote, radical, end quote, first used in a political sense in English in 1797, with reference to movements stirred up by events across the Channel. It entered French some decades later. Only with the rise of modern revolutionary politics does radical cosmopolitanism assume a properly political form, becoming a movement, a party, a project, or a cause. What was it about the French Revolution that affected this shift in conception? How can an event that concerns a particular people be claimed as the birth date of a radical politics that aspires to universality. For skeptics, the historical course of the revolution already belies its imputably cosmopolitan vocation. For did the universalistic passions that inspired it not also inspire the conquering armies that, marching under the tricolor, sought to conquer their neighbors in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity? If so, did they really differ from the Stoic-inspired Romans, or religiously inspired Christians or Muslims who likewise sought to extend civilization or the one true faith? Rather than grant the French Revolution some kind of special status, we might suspect that its true lesson is that any universalism, including and perhaps especially the most, quote, radical, end quote, is inherently ambivalent and reversible, becoming a virulent imperialism as soon as it seeks to press its claim to universality. Balibar, 2002. The case for the French Revolution as an opening onto a new kind of cosmopolitanism rests not only on the revolutionaries' desire to spread the liberty, equality, and solidarity they had declared, but on the fact that they did so not in the first instance by force of arms, but by extending republican citizenship to all, or in the event, to those who had spent a year on French soil, an astonishingly inclusive standard then as now. The capstone of this emancipatory universalism would be the Convention's 1794 decision, during what proved to be the Revolution's most radical phase, to abolish colonial slavery. To be sure, neither measure took full effect and both were soon reversed. Even so, the germ of radical cosmopolitanism in the French Revolution is its unconditional demand for the universalization of freedom, equality, and solidarity by those who would be its beneficiaries. Unlike imperial universalisms or proselytizing religions, the mark of radical cosmopolitanism is radical cosmopolitanism's insistence that emancipation can only be the work of the emancipated, that this can and should include everyone. Massimiliano Tamba, 2015, refers to this radicalism that invites everyone to participate in their own emancipation as insurgent universality. Tamba develops this notion of insurgent universality by setting the French Revolution's 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the model for innumerable later declarations up to and beyond the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, against its much less familiar 1793 sequel. The latter was approved by the convention and in a referendum, but suspended just months later. Where the 1789 declaration sought to elevate the, quote, men, end quote, of the Third Estate to the status of, quote, citizens, end quote, the 1793 version proclaimed the rights of all human beings. Where the former circumscribed the rights it declared within boundaries set by law, the latter declared these rights outright, without limitation or qualification. And where the former recognized a carefully hedged right of, quote, resistance to oppression, end quote, the latter proclaimed, quote, insurrection, end quote, not only, quote, the most sacred of rights, end quote, but, quote, the most indispensable of duties, end quote. The 1793 Declaration thus invited not just the Third Estate or the, quote, nation, end quote, but an indeterminate community of, quote, human beings, end quote, to press their claims, not just within the existing legal framework, but against and potentially beyond the existing legal framework. For Tamba, the difference between the juridical universalism, a fixed doctrine, of the earlier declaration and the radical insurgent universality, an open-ended claim of the later one, reflected their respective political circumstances. Whereas the first voiced the ambitions of citizens taking control of their own state, the second was written under the pressure of a vast mobilization outside the representative system. This mobilization included not only the revolutionary sections, where radical populists known as enragés, should know how to pronounce that, agitated on behalf of the poor, but also women. Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Woman appeared in 1791, and even slaves throwing off their chains in the distant colony of Saint-Domingue. The Haitian Revolution began the same year. By placing priority on the initiatives of civil society, the 1793 Declaration was intrinsically open-ended, enabling claims from those outside the political community, the poor, women, slaves. In so doing, it encouraged the politicization of domains beyond those recognized as belonging to the political realm, from the household to the workplace, to the marketplace, to the colonies, and by opening up domestic, economic, and extraterritorial relations to contestation, these insurgent actors challenged not only the scope of the community, but the nature of politics itself. The Revolution's insurgent universality marked the emergence of a political tradition of radical cosmopolitanism. Universalistic demands like the, quote, rights of man, end quote, were taken up by those for whom they were not originally intended, who had no better claim to these rights than their bare humanity. For this to occur, two things were necessary. First, the demand for rights, dignity, equality, voice had to be universal in the sense of non-exclusive, open to anyone. Here, as on Alain Badiou's conception, the, quote, universal, end quote, designates not simply the sum of all already recognized and ordered elements, subjects, identities, but an opening through which those that fall outside the existing order can reorder the whole. But a second component was no less essential. These demands had to become the basis for practices of self-organization and contestation among the excluded and oppressed. In this way, the universal was set to work as what Jacques Rancière calls, quote, an operator, end quote, to challenge the limits of the existing order. There was no guarantee that this would happen, even less that it would succeed. Then, as since, the immediate stakes of such claims were typically local, but their basis was implicitly and often explicitly universal. The denial of a right or status that, in principle, belongs to everyone came to seem intolerable. This logic of political universalization, then, is the radical cosmopolitan heritage of the French Revolution. It reactivated Diogenes' legacy by setting the claims of the universal and natural, quote, human, end quote, community against all merely conventional political communities. At the same time, like Diogenes' gesture, it left the content and implications of these radical claims to those who took them up. It thereby triggered an indefinitely expansive logic of politicization that formed a matrix for the global movements that made up radical politics over much of the 19th and 20th centuries, from socialism, communism, and anarchism to feminism, anti-colonialism, and anti-racism. Each of these involved politicizing the human against and beyond the limits of established politics. Those who lacked full access to the law or citizenship enacted their cosmopolitan citizenship by pressing their universal claims. Far from being an instance of Eurocentric universal history spreading from an imperial center, in the case of insurgent universality, the engine of universalization was the energy and imagination of the subaltern, who, finding themselves excluded from the universal, seized and reinvented the universal. The fate of the universal, reversals and re-territorializations. There is no better illustration of the explosive logic of radical cosmopolitanism and radical cosmopolitanism's tendency to exceed existing Western universalisms than the Haitian Revolution. Haiti's place in universal history came to be generally appreciated only 2 centuries after the event. Resistance to recognizing the self-liberation of the Haitians, the only successful revolution against slavery, was so pervasive that in 1995, Michel Rolfe Trujillo, it's probably a mispronunciation, made the made the oblivion to which the revolution had been consigned a model for how even scrupulous historiography can silence the past. In the decades since, Trujillo's lament, however, a chorus of historians has not simply inscribed Haiti within the universal history from which it had been banished, but made it the seal of that history's universality. In a veritable flood of publications, scholars argued that the universality of the French Revolution's promise of emancipation was best demonstrated when it was taken up by slaves on the other side of the Atlantic. As Susan Buck Morse put it in a path-breaking essay, quote, "For almost a decade, before the violent elimination of whites signaled their deliberate retreat from universalist principles, the black Jacobins of Saint-Domingue surpassed the metropole in actively realizing the Enlightenment goal of human liberty, seeming to give proof that the French Revolution was not simply a European phenomenon, but world historical in its implications." End quote. This belated enthusiasm for the Haitian Revolution brought together a number of hot academic themes: globalization, imperialism, the, quote, dark side, end quote, of modernity, and not least cosmopolitanism. These attempts to enlist the long-neglected episode in what Kant called the, quote, history with a cosmopolitan intent, end quote, illuminate both the specificity and the ambivalences of radical cosmopolitanism. One concern was the danger that particular historical events would be co-opted. As Adam Getachew argues, the inscription of Haiti into a, quote, realization narrative, end quote, on which the Haitians merely appropriate a truth invented in Europe, renders their initiative derivative, a case of what Depeche Chakrabarty calls the logic of, quote, first in Europe, then elsewhere, end quote. Treating the Haitian events as an echo of a French original obscures their singularity and originality. In fact, Getachew notes the Haitian Revolution was a revolt against slavery and ultimately imperialism, not as in France against absolutism and privileges. Moreover, as Marxist historians like C.L.R. James pointed out long ago, to the extent that the profits of the slave trade flowed to the French bourgeoisie, it was in a sense a revolt against the French Revolution, or at least many of the French Revolution's leaders, and the Haitian revolt owed at least as much to African and Creole traditions as it did to the Enlightenment and the rights of man. Another ambivalence concerns the revolution's political fate. Not only Buck Morse, but also James, whose seminal 1938 Black Jacobins made the first robust case for the Haitian Revolution's global significance, tend to identify its universality with its hero, Toussaint Louverture, and his 1801 Constitution. Louverture himself saw Haiti as the French Revolution's natural successor, but his gambit failed. He was captured during Napoleon's brutal retaking of the island in 1802 and died in a French prison the following year. The Haitian Revolution was in fact only saved by his successor, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. I don't know how to pronounce that. A rough leader who drove out the French army, ordered the massacre of the white population, and declared Haitian independence in 1804. For Buck Morse, this successful defense of the revolution marked a, quote, retreat from universalist principles, end quote, not just because of its violence, but also because Haiti's 1805 constitution prohibited white land ownership and declared all Haitians, quote, black, end quote, including Europeans who had joined the revolt. Thus, Haiti's freedom was secured not by the cosmopolitan Louverture, a Jacobin and proponent of the universal rights of man, but of the fierce Dessalines, who did so not in the name of universal humanity, but of a particularistic new nationality. These developments cast doubt on efforts to claim the Haitian Revolution for cosmopolitanism in two ways. The first concerns politics. While the sparks that lit the Haitian revolt may have been universalistic in many respects, its denouement was not. For some, this reflects the general lesson that while principles and demands may be universal, political communities are particular and always define themselves in opposition to others. This is especially the case with anti-colonial and other subaltern movements, since they cannot hope to survive without securing for themselves a material basis such as the sanctuary of a state. Thus, while another great Caribbean revolutionary, Frantz Fanon, took the title of what would become the most influential book in the anti-colonial canon, The Wretched of the Earth, from the Internationale, the anthem of the international workers' movement, he never imagined that the liberation he aimed at could be anything other than national. As Balibar explains, this is because politics cannot consist only of insurrection, but must also lead to constitution, the construction of new identities and institutions which are necessarily particular. A second source of doubt for inscribing the Haitian Revolution in a cosmopolitan narrative is based not on the resolution of its universality into particularity, but on the limits of that universality. Here the concern is that, although the revolutionaries may have succeeded in freeing themselves first from slavery and then from French domination, their liberation quickly ran up against hard limits. The fact that Louverture made himself governor-general for life of the French dominion of Haiti, while Dessalines proclaimed himself emperor and Haiti an empire, may reflect not so much their own limitations as the fact that even a liberated Haiti had to gird itself against a world of hostile empires. Likewise, the fact that both of them found it necessary to dragoon the newly freed slaves from their small plots and put them back to work on plantations reflected not so much the revolution's betrayal or hypocrisy as Haiti's desperate need for export crops in a competitive world market. For the Haitians had freed themselves into a world of unequal states and market relations, so that even after emancipation, Haiti remains subject to a capitalist and imperialist international order that profoundly restricted its options, and indeed remains in this condition today. There are limits, then, to the extent to which the Haitian Revolution can be placed in a cosmopolitan narrative. The lesson of such considerations should not be to discount the revolution's universal significance, however, but to draw it with greater attention to the event's specificity. Gatichou reminds us that, despite its precarious situation, Haiti became a beacon and sanctuary for thousands of escaped slaves from elsewhere in the region, where the slave trade intensified in the decades after Haiti achieved independence. It did this in part by extending the right of asylum to blacks and indigenous people seeking their freedom, conferring citizenship on the same generous terms as their earlier French Gatichou reminds us, despite its precarious situation, Haiti became a beacon and sanctuary for thousands of escaped slaves from elsewhere in the region, where the slave trade intensified in the decades after Haiti achieved independence. It did this in part by extending the right of asylum to blacks and indigenous people seeking their freedom, conferring citizenship on the same generous terms as the earlier French revolutionaries had done after just a year of residency. Haiti also pursued abolition as a foreign policy, intercepting slave ships and offering sanctuary and assistance to Simon Bolivar on the condition that he committed himself to ending slavery. And we should not fail to recognize that emancipating hundreds of thousands of Haitians and their descendants from the dehumanizing, often deadly fate of bondage was itself not a negligible achievement. Despite its limitations, then, the cosmopolitanism of the Haitian Revolution reached places, people, and domains beyond the imagining of the European, quote, inventors, end quote, of the rights of man, identifying the idea of universal emancipation not with the French inventors of the rights of man, but with their New World reinventors, who put the claim to equal freedom to unanticipated uses, shifts the locus of radical cosmopolitanism from modernity's center to its margins. Rather than seeing such values and practices as freedom, equality, democracy, and human rights as being first actualized in the North Atlantic core and then radiating out through the rest of the world, a radical cosmopolitan perspective would emphasize that this center's centrality rested even during the French Revolution, not on its domination and exploitation of expanding swaths of the rest of the planet. This does not negate the emancipatory significance of the revolution's principles. However, since they were reactivated and reinvented at diverse points on the periphery of those subject to domination and exploitation, fought for and sometimes won their freedom, from this perspective, the true cosmopolitans were the insurgent anti-colonialists, defenders of universal emancipation, who turned it against the false universalism of the center. Beyond universalism. Let me finally consider a further and, in a sense, deeper objection to the tradition of radical insurgent cosmopolitanism I have outlined here. This objection does not simply question the Western roots and biases of this tradition, and so the validity of its universalism, but rather the very idea of universality itself. Those who make this objection argue that because today's hegemonic universalisms are identified with a particular project, that of Western techno-capitalist, statist, imperialist modernity, our aim should be to refuse not only this project, but also the very idea of cosmopolitanism, universality, and modernity, at least in the modern period within what the decolonial school calls, quote, modernity/coloniality, end quote, Mignolo, 2007. Such ideas are at the root of the problem. Indeed, from this perspective, the fact that the logic of universality has seduced the resistance against modernity/coloniality is why even the latter's triumphs have almost invariably led to disaster, from totalitarian, quote, workers' democracies, end quote, to corrupt and tyrannical post-colonial states and societies. For this reason, such critics suggest we should abandon any aspiration to radical or insurgent universality which remains too close to the bad universalism of the status quo, and instead embrace, quote, pluriversalism, a defense of cultures and ways of life that remain at least partly outside the orbit of modernity/coloniality. I have some sympathy with this argument, even as I worry that the dichotomy toward which this argument tends may be reductive and misleading. Aspects of modernity have been emancipatory and salutary. After all, while aspects of tradition, localism, and so on have been the opposite, all the same, there are good reasons to remain attached to the ideas of cosmopolitanism and universality, even after taking full measure of the distance of the radical insurgent version I have outlined here from more dominant varieties. One reason is strategic. It concerns the fact that even if the modern world is more variegated than the formula, quote, modernity/coloniality, end quote, suggests, the object to which this formula points is a system. A highly complex totality is sustained by vast resources and power. It was this system as a massive empirical fact on a world scale, and not simply the hegemony of modern colonial thinking, that comprised or derailed Haiti's emancipation. And because it is a system, the experience of oppression, exploitation, dispossession, and exclusion this system generates often have commonalities. Resistance to this system, even when it is local and organized around particular concerns, can draw strength and insight from understanding the system as a system, and also itself is engaged in a common struggle towards common aims. This will be true even if the commonality involves translation and reinvention, as when a European struggle against absolutism and privileges helps inspire a colonial one against slavery and colonialism. It is when we consider politics itself, however, that the origin of the radical cosmopolitanism tradition in the West appears most limited and suspect. For beyond its sense of universality and forward-looking political action, what connects this tradition back to the French Revolution is a specific conception of politics, linked to a particular configuration of power, the state and society. This may be what accounts for the politicalness of radical cosmopolitanism, but it is also what accounts for its historical record of disaster. Post-colonial critics from Partha Chatterjee in 1986 to David Scott in 2004 have produced rich studies of what they see as the tragedy of anti-colonial movements, arguing that these movements' failure to escape the snares of statist politics is what led them to convert emancipation into new forms of domination. The cosmopolitan element of more modern radicalism has always strained against the limits of this statist conception of politics. As the case of Haiti and others around the post-colonial world demonstrate, it is a challenge radicals have neither solved nor transcended. Could decolonial thought, which seeks alternatives beyond the horizon of modern politics, perhaps aided by anarchism, ecology, indigenous thought, and other unrealized traditions outside the main current of modern political history, help radical politics reinvent new possibilities beyond these tragic impasses? Radicals and cosmopolitans can only hope so. Optimism would seem premature, but I will close with grounds for cautious hope. It is an intrinsic property of the radical cosmopolitan tradition of insurgent universality, as I have argued, not only to open politics to new actors, subjects, and concerns, but in so doing to spur the transformation of politics itself. Such transformations have happened before, albeit in what now seem to be all too limited ways, in such cases as the social question, the colonial question, the woman question, and others besides. Could this happen again with the nature question, the settler indigenous question, the technology question, and others we do not yet know how to name? If it does, I would hazard it will only be because insurgent radical cosmopolitans succeed in finding new ways to politicize these questions by insisting in a cynic spirit on the demands of the universal beyond the current limits of our political imagination.